Well, hello once again, and another hearty welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where of course we check out more of those old vintage dirt bikes from our racing past and just try and learn a little bit more about the fascinating facts and even some of the intricate workings of some of these old vintage dirt bikes. Now, with regards my subscribers total, we have now surpassed that 13,000 total, and I think since my last video posting we've added at least another 300 members to our channel. So once again, it's thanks to each and every one of you out there for your continuing support of my channel. And I didn't even think for a minute that since I started uploading my video footage way back in 2007 that this channel would become so popular. But once again, thanks to each and every one of you for your continuing support. Now, coming up next on this channel, we're going to take a look at another very rare machine. Now, this is a bike, of course, that's taken from the Rob Hughes classic dirt bike collection. Now, this is probably a bike that you've never heard of, and in fact, I had never heard of this bike until I actually saw it in the flesh. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into the video and take a look at this 1988 Cheney Husqvarna 510. Now, during the 1960s and 1970s, Britain had some of the best off-road motorcycle designers in the world at that time, and the likes of the Rickman brothers, Matisse, and even CCM were all building top quality motorcycle chassis that were being sold across the globe. Now, one such other engineer was Eric Cheney, who in his earlier years was a very talented off-road rider before he then began designing and constructing his very own off-road motorcycle frames. Now, Eric had no formal training as a motorcycle designer, yet he was still able to create original, very high quality chassis from his simple workshop, which was essentially nothing more than a small domestic garage. Now, they also say that Eric's approach to designing and building motorcycle frames was often described as being like a medieval engineer, because Eric was old school and he worked entirely on his gut instinct and intuition. Eric, of course, was always famous for sketching his motorcycle frame designs full scale and in chalk, where he would then draw them on his workshop wall and then just sit and stare at his latest etchings and then add or remove various rubbings until he thought he had the basis of a decent frame design. And he was once quoted as saying, "I know almost instantly when a design is right, and it just screams back at me if it's wrong." Although Eric did go on to produce some of the country's best quality chassis during the 1960s and 1970s. Now, this featured bike that we're looking at here is a 1988 Cheney frame with a Husqvarna 510 4-stroke motor as its power plant. Now, the story goes is that this example here was a bike that Eric built for his son Simon to race at local scrambles events, and it's also said that this bike and only another 4 or 5 of these were ever put together, although whatever became of the other 5 machines is still a bit of a mystery. But the bike is powered by this 510 4-stroke water-cooled Husqvarna motor, and a few of the other parts that are used on this Cheney machine all come straight of a 1988 Husky 4-stroke 510 enduro bike. Essentially though, the engine is of course a single cylinder but has a twin port cylinder head with the water pump of course driven straight off of the engine's camshaft, and the bike's chassis number is also stamped number CHH9967 for all of you aficionados who like to trace the the origins of these kind of extremely rare machines. But these big thumper Huskies are just basically the same bottom end that you would find on the air-cooled 510, although of course this motor has the more modern liquid-cooled barrel and head on it. Now with regards the engine, if you're looking for the radiator on this bike, then you're maybe best to stop looking now, because it doesn't have a radiator, strangely enough, because this particular Cheney frame is where the cooling is actually done, whereby the chassis carries the coolant and any air that's trapped in the cooling system was then bled from these bleed valves at the rear of these frame tubes. So basically it works quite similar to your domestic central heating system in your house, whereby the heat is dissipated through the frame and any trapped air is then bled out. But I think the whole idea was really just to reduce the weight of the bike carrying a radiator full of coolant, but how it actually worked in practice, I'm not sure. Although I have to say that the power that was supplied by this pretty awesome Husky 4-stroke motor was more than adequate for that very unique Cheney frame, and these TELC engines were extremely tough and very reliable, and I think they also had a 6-speed transmission as well, so you had plenty cogs to play with when you were bombing around the racetrack on this big thumper. Now once more, as we turn to the bike's front end, now this to me is a little bit of a mystery really, because as you'd expect, very little is known about this rare bike, and even various attempts by myself of contacting Cheney Racing never turned up any replies, although these forks do look like they could be a set of white power upside down units. But again, I'm only really guessing here, but who knows, maybe you know better. And again, more than likely these hydraulic disc brakes were once more taken straight from the donor Husqvarna Enduro bike of 1988, and these front stoppers would have been state of the art, I suppose, back in the late 1980s, and naturally these would have been a lot better than the older drum brakes that would have been fitted to the old Husqvarna bikes of the 1970s. But another single pot hydraulic brake on the rear here as well, and these weren't super powerful brakes, but they were more than adequate to slow down that back wheel. But once more, this heavy duty alloy box section swing arm is another part that was lifted from the 1988 Husqvarna Enduro bike, and these parts were very strong and reasonably light for such a sizable unit. Now in this shot here you can see exactly where the 3 mounting holes were for the Enduro bike's side stand, although of course on this Cheney machine this has been removed, more than likely just to reduce the bike's overall weight. Now once again, as you can see, a single monoshock rear piggyback suspension system on our Cheney Husky, and as you can see, a top of the range Öhlins piggyback shock has been used, but these Swedish made Öhlins shocks are all singing and dancing when it comes to rebound and damping, and they're also highly tunable and of course fully rebuildable as well. Now that little alloy box that you can see on the right hand side of the rear shock is of course the air filter airbox, and if you also look closely to the left hand side of the top shock mounting, and you can also see the coolant filler cap as well. And as you can see, the air filter could be accessed reasonably quickly by removing a couple of these twist and pull securing clips that held this panel onto the frame, and that little alloy disc that's sticking out from the panel was to allow a bit more room for the foam filter to fit in behind. But it was certainly all a very tight squeeze to fit all of these parts underneath the seat. Now, as you've no doubt already guessed, the bike's fuel tank again is a bespoke custom-made alloy unit by Cheney themselves, and as you can see, it's quite an intricate work of art in its own right with all of those turns and awkward corners. But the tank was a custom-made job to fit this Cheney chassis and, of course, that big Husqvarna motor. Now, this quite unusual filler cap on the top of the tank is not your run-of-the-mill motorcycle filler cap. This is actually what they call a Bransell filler cap that's normally used for boats and other marine going craft, but it certainly doesn't look out of place on this very unique motorcycle. And again, because this is pretty much a custom-made bike, these exhausts, of course, had to be specifically made to fit around that Husqvarna engine and, of course, the rest of the Cheney frame, which in turn led onto this single chrome-plated megaphone tailpipe at the rear, and you can only imagine what kind of sound comes out of this pipe when that big 510 four-banger Husky motor gets fired into life. Although I have to say that the seat on our particular Cheney Husky here looks like it could do a very good job and looks like it has sufficient cushioning and padding to soften out even the roughest of racetracks. And again, the front of the seat extends right onto the back of the fuel tank so that the rider can shift his weight around on the bike if he wants to maybe sit back to lighten that front end, or maybe jump onto the back of the tank just to help the bike make some sharper turns. And so as we get to the bike's controls department, a Swedish-made Gunnar Gasser throttle has been fitted to try and control the many horses that will be let loose from that big Husky motor. And of course a set of Magura levers are also used to work that hydraulic front disc brake. And again, a Magura lever here on the clutch side, and which is of course is cable operated, and of course a decompressor lever to aid the starting of that big 510 four-stroke Husky engine. Now, the bike's front and rear mudguards are supplied by Acerbis, who, as you know, are an Italian-based company who have been supplying motorcycle race products to the industry since 1973. And even here in 2021, Acerbis are still one of the world leaders in supplying motocross plastic components. Now, just exactly what this bike was like to ride, I'm not entirely sure, because as I said, I was unable to gain any information on any of the riders who rode this bike, although going by what we've seen here with that quite innovative Cheney frame and that big Husqvarna four-stroke motor, and of course the decent front end and rear suspension, this quite rare bike still has the look of a machine that would do quite well on the racetrack, although mind you, how that quite radical sealed cooling system would perform in a real situation, I'd certainly like to know, especially when you consider that this bike had no radiator to speak of to lower the temperature of the coolant. Although then again, if that radical cooling system did work and work well, then you'd have to ask yourself, why do we still have radiators on modern day motocrossers these days? But then again, maybe Cheney were ahead of the game with that radical cooling system idea, and maybe we're not giving Cheney the credit they deserve here. But of course, until we actually speak to the bike's builders or riders, we'll unfortunately never know. Although either way, I have to say there's certainly no escaping the fact that this machine is still without doubt a fantastic looking race bike, and certainly innovative in its design and execution. And it just goes to show what a great engineering mind the late Eric Cheney had, because just looking at this finished bike here, I can still imagine Eric sitting on a seat in his workshop staring up at the chalked outline of this chassis on his wall in 1988 and then thinking to himself, yeah, that looks about right. Now where's my bloody welder? Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that brief walk around another classic from Rob Hughes' collection, a very rare 1988 Cheney Husqvarna machine. One of only maybe a half a dozen bikes that were made, so they say, but whatever happened to the rest of the bikes in that production run, I'm not exactly sure, but nonetheless, that sole survivor is certainly another rare machine from our past motocross racing history. Okay, coming up in my next video, we're going to take a look at a bike I came across in my paddock travels during 2021, and next time round we'll take a look at this lovely Honda CR500 Evolution machine. Now this bike belongs to Scottish rider Ian Clark, and as you can see, it's not your run-of-the-mill CR500 Honda, but we will take a look at this bike in my next video here on my channel. But until then, of course, everybody continue to be safe and well out there, and watch what you're doing when you're riding those old vintage race bikes, and we'll all get back here together again very soon to talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.